Welcome back to the Talking Archive. I'm Josh Jacobs, and our conversation continues now with engineer, production director, and voiceover talent Douglas C. Brown. Now, you got to work with your three idols, the reason you got into radio, and that was Dave Hull, the Hullabluer, Johnny Hayes, and Jimmy Rabbit. Now, tell us about Jimmy Rabbit, who was born Dale Payne, because that's who you got to work with first.
Yeah, Rabbit was somebody who you could never control his playlist. I mean, if you hired Rabbit to do anything, you're going to get what Rabbit wanted to do. I'll never forget hearing Rabbit. After all his success at KRLA in LA, he got hired by ABC Network out of New York to do this Love Network thing.
Mm-hmm.
The brother John Rydgren was the main voice. And Rabbit was, I think they had him, well, it was a national thing, but he'd ended up being on at night on the West Coast anyway, on what was KBC FM at that point before it was even KLOS. And it was really funny because a couple of things I thought were really funny about it was in the New York studios, they put Rabbit on a pair of stereo mics for the announcer. And I guess they thought they were being really clever.
Mm-hmm.
Doing this. I've seen a picture of it. There is a still out there of Rabbit with those like two Electro Voice 635 mics, which were really stupid for stereo on top of it because they're omnidirectional microphones. But anyway, Rabbit had this habit of moving around when he talks. When he announces, he would move his head left to right, back and forth. And so, if you were trying to listen to Rabbit on the Love Network in headphones, it was like psychedelic. It was like it would make you seasick because he'd end up being, panning left, pan right, pan left, pan right. Then he'd back off, and it was really a weird sound. They didn't stick with that for very long, for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
But what I remember about that particularly was when Paul McCartney's first solo album came out, the one with the bowl of cherries on the cover, which I guess was 1970. When Rabbit was there on ABC, they had some very tight formatics because they had to build in commercial stop sets, and they were feeding these tapes to a whole network of stations, so they had to hit the stop sets on time and such. So I'll never forget this. He starts tracking the whole album, the whole McCartney album, and then he gets interrupted by a stop set. He has to stop. And so then he comes back after the stop sets and starts back at the top of the album and just lets it track again. I was like, oh my God. I mean, and this is so Rabbit, and there's no way you can control him, I mean, with him, you got, my favorite saying that Rabbit used to use was, I never promised to be good. I just promised to be here. I thought, what a classic quote from a disc jockey. And of course, Rabbit was the ultimate non-disc jockey.
Yeah.
He was like the anti-disc jockey.
Well, I remember back in reading the book Dream House by Bill Earl, the official KRLA historian. And,
I know Bill well.
And how when Jimmy Rabbit came to KRLA, basically it was top 40 during the daytime from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. with a few golden touches and album cuts during the hour. But then from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. it was Rabbit followed by Johnny Hayes bringing their own music and doing their own thing. Basically it was freeform FM on AM during those hours. And they even had like a picture of Jimmy Rabbit with sunglasses that had carrots in the lenses.
I remember that ad quite clearly.
And they said that the book basically said once Doug Cox decided to go back to straight top 40, that's pretty much was the beginning of the end of Jimmy Rabbit being there, because Jimmy Rabbit didn't want to deviate from the playlist. And so unfortunately he got let go due to that. Well,
he was hired by Bill Drake for KHJ and lasted exactly 3 nights.
Wow.
Because he wouldn't follow the format. He was far from a boss jock. I don't know what Bill Drake at all were thinking when they hired Rabbit. They just knew he had ratings, and he had a following, but he was like the anti-boss jock, It was ridiculous. I have somebody said they had an air check of some of those 3 nights, but I've never heard them. But I can imagine, because that's not Rabbit's thing. You know, he's not going to be talking up intros and hitting posts and, you know, flinging jingles here and there and doing live spots, which the Boss Jocks did a lot of. They did a lot of live commercials.
Oh yeah,
and that wasn't Rabbit's forte.
But that was something great for the advertiser, was that the jocks would do the live reads themselves instead of just some canned commercials, because he kind of felt like it was part of the show. Which even the Freeform FM jocks did some live reads as well for, you know, waterbed stores and stereo shops and concerts. So you felt like it was part of the program itself, rather than just, oh, here's another break.
Sure.
In 1972, after Rabbit was at KHJ, he went to 1500 KROQ, which is where you were, I think. Right. So tell us how you got to 1500 KROQ and your first meeting with Jimmy Rabbit. So
I had been a big music fan from when I was a teenager. In fact, I used to make 4-track and then 8-track tapes for my car and for my friends' cars in the mid '60s, so that was really my first taking a fling at programming, you know, picking the right songs in the right order and blah blah blah, and putting together these tapes for the car. Okay, so I think what happened for me actually was listening to Rabbit and Johnny Hayes nights on KRLA. And I thought, gee, this is really interesting. I think I want to explore what this radio thing is about. At the time, I was a business major at what's now Cal State Northridge. At the time, it was San Fernando Valley State College. But they had a non-commercial FM on campus, 88.5, what's now KCSN. Mm-hmm. And I walked in there. I was a business major at Northridge in '69, and I walked in there one day, and I looked around at this radio station, and I saw all these guys that seemed just like me. And here I was, as a business major, walking around with these guys with their wingtip shoes and Samsonite briefcases. And I thought, wait a minute, there's something happening out there, folks. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of, unrest on campus and such. I don't know if you know at the time, but there was National Guard on campus at a point in time because of the anti-war demonstrations. A bunch of hotheads actually lit the administration building on fire and all this kind of stuff. So there's a lot of things happening in 1969. That was a year of change. So I decided that this radio thing seemed like more viable to me than being a marketing major. So I changed majors to radio, TV, film, and got involved with the campus FM station. And it was a magazine formatted station, a little bit of everything, all kinds of different music and talk and public affairs and news and all kinds of stuff. And it was all student operated. People would do it for course credit or just for experience. And we had a lot of people move on from that station into the mainstream commercial radio. People like Rich Murata, who went on to do sport all over the place and did mornings with KFI for a long time. Rich was my sports director. What happened was, after a while, I got to be student chief engineer, and then when they went to hire a full-time staff general manager for the station, I was the first paid by the state of California to be the general manager. That was in May of '71. So I was in charge of the whole operation, which was about 80 volunteer students. Some getting course credit, some just doing it for the fun of it, and it was a really interesting adventure. And so I got totally immersed in non-commercial radio. We were also right at the beginning of NPR, National Public Radio, at that time. So that was really exciting time to do that. And then what happened was I think it was probably the fall, maybe late summer of '71. One of the guys from Northridge had gotten a part-time job at KBBQ in Burbank, AM 1500, jockeying on the weekend, doing fill-in and stuff. Well, I got word from him that they were looking for an engineer to work on the weekends to switch the West Coast Mutual News operation, which came out of New York, but there was a West Coast feed that would be generated separately at KBBQ and sent to several stations in the West. So I started doing that, moonlighting on the weekends. So I was full-time GM at what was KEDC-FM, became KCSN, and I started, working as an IBEW engineer in there. So I got my foot in the door in commercial radio. And I kept doing that. I was doing vacation relief and all kinds of various things at KBBQ. And then by fall of 72, the station was sold to this group called Burbank Broadcasting Company, which flipped it to KROQ AM in September of 72.
And you had quite a big jock lineup there. You had former KHJ and KRLA jocks there, including Charlie Tuna in the morning. You had Johnny Darren, I think, is the program director. You had Sam Riddle. You had Jimmy Rabbit, Jim Wood, and a couple of others who I'm forgetting right now. But I heard that the jocks were making $100,000 a year each in 1972 money. That's crazy.
Well, there was a lot of crazy financial stuff going on. By the way, Rabbit was a holdover from KBBQ. He was playing country music primarily on KBBQ before it switched to KROQ. He was a holdover.
Oh, wow.
Which was kind of remarkable, actually. But Rabbit was that kind of guy. He could do that. So, yeah, they weren't making that kind of money. But I'll tell you what, the real problem with KROQ, AM, and then later FM, was that it was a totally undercapitalized operation. They had all kinds of dreams of taking on KHJ and KRLA without a full signal, without a full market signal. I mean, everybody knew that the 10,000 watts up there in the mountains of Glendale, day or night, was not going to cover the market. But they had dreams of taking them on. And unfortunately, the revenue never followed. It was undercapitalized, and pretty soon, early on, the checks started bouncing. Paychecks started bouncing, and that's about the time Tuna turned around and left the door, right out the door, because it was not, it was pretty obvious that it was not working economically. There was a lot of the advertising on the air, as I remember, was trade. There wasn't a lot of cash flow, and I think they did hire. I mean, they had everything from a 3-man news department to a public affairs director to all the air talent. I mean, they were staffing this thing up in a high profile manner to look like the big time, and it probably would have worked if it was on FM, and that would have been an early rocker on FM, or an AM station with a full signal. A full market signal, because they certainly did a lot of promotion and they worked really hard at it. But the fact is, you couldn't really hear it in Long Beach. You know, that was a real problem. So to quote that dollar amount per disc jockey, that's an outrageous amount of money, and I doubt if that was the case. But I do know is that very shortly, some of the talent started dropping away because the checks were bouncing. And then a lot of us behind the scenes, engineers and others, a lot of us stayed on based on promises of forthcoming money. So we were being written checks that weren't cashable. So we were basically working for free for several months. By the time Shadow Stevens came over from KRLA, and he took over as program director, that's about the time they acquired 106.7, and it became KROQ FM and AM simulcast at that point. But the revenue wasn't there. I think at that point, by the time they bought the FM, it was really too late. They were so financially underwater that it wasn't going to survive. Part of the problem, too, the ownership of the station was a partnership of, I believe it was 13 or 14 minority owners. And that was really hard to manage, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So even though they had a lot of high-profile people, they had ex-KHJ general manager and sales manager, and they talked a good game, and they attracted a lot of LA talent, which was very, very helpful. Don Elliott was the production director. He was an ace at that, and he went on to work at KISS FM and KFI and Coast for years after that. But so they had a lot of a deep bench of talent, but the business model was just wrong. So I think that kind of sums up what happened with KROQ. And then by the spring of 73, I think it was, or 4, I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. By the spring of 74, this would have been after the FM was on the air, maybe about 6 months. It was just, they were losing people right and left, and because nobody was getting paid. And what's here's this is an interesting story. This is kind of a bookend story for me for KROQ. Mm-hmm. On the first day that KROQ AM launched as a top 40 format, and they launched with those call letters, they were really pushing the old 10 kilowatt transmitter up on the mountaintop off Beaudry Drive in Glendale for maximum modulation. It was an old transmitter, and when you just pushed it all the time, it would shut down. So you'd have to manually reset the plates on the thing. And they couldn't afford, after all this promotion and attention it was getting, to be off the air for any significant period of time. And the remote control down to the Burbank studios up to the mountain in Glendale was iffy. The remote control was iffy. It was on telephone lines. Mm. But anyway, so they stationed me up there because I was, a licensed engineer. I had first phone and all this, so I was the engineer on duty at the transmitter site for that first day, which I think I was up there for like 12 continuous hours. And every time the damn thing would bump off, I'd have to manually reset the transmitter and get it back on the air within seconds. So that was my job. Now, fast forward down to spring of 74. Shadow Stevens had lost air staff, so he basically put me on the overnight shift. Mm. So I was doing midnight to 6. Now, the fun part about that was that I was following Rabbit. He worked up till midnight. So I got to cross with Rabbit and got to spend some time with him, which was really cool because he was one of my original inspirations in this whole radio business. So it was really cool. He turned me on to people. I remember he was playing Jolene by Dolly Parton in the mix, along with all the rock, all the early 70s rock.
So Dolly Parton does belong in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame after all because of Jimmy Rabbit.
It could be. It could be. And so I had followed Rabbit. So one day, I believe this was in May of 74, I'm sitting there, the sun is coming up. It's coming up on 6 a.m. or something, early. And I look out the window at the studios there at 99 South Chester in Pasadena. It was on the ground floor with lots of glass. I see this guy in overalls walking to the back of the building. I thought, I wonder what he's doing. Well, I'm sitting there, and we were playing a lot of vinyl direct to air. Almost all of it was vinyl direct to air, turntables spinning, mm-hmm. right? Well, at that point, the Eagles album was on the border and had that song James Dean. Mm-hmm. Well, the recurring chorus in the thing is "Too fast to live, too young to die, bye-bye," right? Mm-hmm. James Dean, right? Well, anyway, that thing is actually playing on the turntable, and at the very moment that this guy in the overalls, turned out he was the Pasadena Power Department, he's walking in the back of the building, he's pulling the meter for lack of payment. I mean, this whole place was going bankrupt fast. So he walks back there and pulls the meter until instantly the whole building goes dark and quiet, just as the Eagles were singing that. And I thought it was just hilarious because just as they hit that lyric, "Too fast to live, too young to die, boy, boy," as the turntable stopped. I thought this was just too poetic for words. I mean, it was just hilarious to me. And of course, there I am sitting in the dark and realizing it's all over at that point. It's done. So, and luckily for me, there was an opening for an engineer at KHJ, K-Earth, mm-hmm. opening up right after that. So I wasn't employed for very long. I went immediately over to KHJ and K-Earth. Again, it's an IBEW engineer running the K-Earth's automation and switching the on-air show on KHJ. And at that point, it was still a split operation where the disc jockeys didn't touch anything except the mic switch. All the show, all the records, all the commercials, jingles, reel-to-reel tapes, whatever, were all run by engineers. So that was quite a shock for me from coming from KHJ and playing, Radar Love by Goldie Airing, to then segue into KHJ. And I remember the first song I played was "Tell Me Something Good" by Rufus. You come out of the jingle 93 KHJ, and then wop 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 something good, and I go, oh my God, this is like a real shocker.
No Chaka Khan on KROQ. By the way, where was KROQ Studios?
That was at 99 South Chester. That was the FM, in Pasadena.
Oh, okay. And they were off the air for a couple of years after that, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. Yeah. What happened was there was a lot of us unpaid employees who were still hanging around. So we had all filed complaints with the California Department of Labor. So if they had turned that thing back on the air, we would have been all over them as far as getting paid. So what happened is, I understand that the new alleged owner, Ken Roberts, decided to put this thing back on the air, the FM for sure, and the AM if he could figure it out, was he started offering, I don't know, as I remember, it was like 50 cents on the dollar for us to just go away and withdraw our Department of Labor complaints and claims, which we did. At that point, 2 years passed after the fact. I just took whatever money they were offering and signed off and said, okay, I'm done. But that's when they restarted it with, a shoestring, hiring just people off the street. And, and it started to evolve into what became, a very successful operation years later. But see, there was a lot of problems with the FCC in those years, too, because there was technical violations, legal violations. There was all kinds of stuff. And the FCC just wanted to get this license off their hands. They wanted it resolved. So I think eventually they just awarded it to Ken Roberts et al. To make it a clean break. And then it turned into something, very successful, obviously, despite the rocky start.
It's the Talking Archive. I'm Josh Jacobs. We're talking with Douglas C. Brown, engineer, production director for many radio stations in Southern California, as well as voice-over talent. He's been talking about his years at KROQ, 1500 KROQ, the Roq of Los Angeles, as well as the early days of 106.7 FM. And next time, Doug talks about his time at 93 KHJ and some of the magic he got to work there.